Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Autodesk Virtual Academy, brought to you guys by Cative Technologies. I'm Nigel Mbayak here, application engineer and customer success manager here at our Cative Brea facility. And today, I've got someone really cool joining me, Mr. Killicam himself, Cameron Wetton. How's it going, Cameron?
It's going great. Thanks, Nigel.
Awesome. So Cameron's on our team as an application engineer. Cameron works a lot with our Lifeline team, for those of you who've called into support before, as well as he works on a lot of inventor automation related projects. And part of some of that automation is to generate a interface for people to, I guess, interact with said automation that they've created in the form of forms, for lack of a better word there. So, Cameron came to me about a month, maybe 2 months ago and said, hey, I've been talking to a lot of customers I've been working on projects with, and they want to know more about forms. These are things that people ask about because it is what ultimately at the end of the day you are interacting with to work on your automation. So we decided, hey, let's go ahead and start unraveling some of the mystery behind that. So we'll do it for an AVA, and that's kind of how this started. I know Cameron's been working on this for a while, but this is kind of what he does on a daily basis. So I don't think there's anyone better here at the company to be able to talk to you all about this today. Cameron, anything else you got to add there?
No, that's a great intro. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So if you have any questions at all, go ahead and type those into the chat panels in your respective viewing windows, and I'll make sure I get to those during the session or at the end during our dedicated Q&A. So definitely thank you all for being here, and I expect to be here for the next 40 minutes or so. Cameron, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thanks, Nigel. So, like Nigel said, iLogic gives us the power to automate our inventor designs, and iLogic forms connect this automation to the user experience. And I think knowing how to build iLogic forms is an essential skill for any advanced designer, whether you want to quickly test a few key design parameters or control a complex design that has many parameters. And we're going to cover all you need to know to build iLogic forms. We're going to go over all the tools in the kit, and I'm going to suggest some strategies for making the most of those tools. And yeah, I think that's all the intro we need. I think we should just jump right into it. So I'm going to launch up Inventor. And we'll get down to it. So here I've got a clear plastic plate with a pattern of holes around the perimeter. And I've set it up so that the user can input the quantity of holes and the distance from the edge, and the spacing of the holes basically figures itself out based on some logic that I've put into this part. So let's take a quick look at the parameters that are in here. And we've got a few parameters that the user is going to be inputting and interacting with to change the whole quantity, as well as the size of the plate, thickness, that sort of thing. And then I've got some parameters that have formulas in them that are actually controlling the spacing of those holes and how the pattern lays out, and as well as whether there's rounded corners or not. So as is, this model is automated to reconfigure itself, but as is, the user has to interact through the parameters editor by changing values here. So let's learn how to create a form instead. So to create a form, you'll want to have your iLogic browser turned on. If you don't have that, you just hit the plus, and then you'll see an option for iLogic here, and I've already got it turned on. So there's my iLogic browser, and then you want to switch over to forms. And right now I don't have any forms in this document. We're going to create one. So you just right-click in anywhere in this empty space and click on Add Form. And what comes up here is our form editor. And I'll give you a quick tour of what you see here. On the left, you're going to see a list of different things you can add to your form. So if this is all new to you, a form is basically just a dialog, a window in Windows that you use to interact with the model. And different elements of the form are called controls. And so on the left here is a list of different types of controls that you can add to your form. And that basically works by selecting a control and then just dragging it over into this area and dropping it there. So this area here is where you're going to actively build your form. And as you click and drag things over, they get added to the form list here. And then you'll also see this over here is a preview of what my form is going to look like. And I can't actually interact with it, change values, but it's just a preview to show as you build things or add controls to your form, it shows you how it's building out. And then down in this part of the window, for any item that you have selected, it's going to show you a list of properties or settings for that particular control. And so when I select one of these parameters, it shows me all the properties that I can adjust for that particular control. And then this, the top one here is the form itself, which has some properties that you can adjust. And we'll talk about those in a minute. So let's see. And down here, there's a little preview whenever you've got a control selected and you click on the different settings. This gives you a brief description of what that setting does. And then down in this lower left corner, we have the toolbox, which gives us different tools that we can use to organize our controls and control how our form is laid out. And for the different types of controls that you can add, we've got parameters and rules. You can actually add iLogic rules to your form. So this is one of the rules I have in my current document. If I click and drag that over, let's see, it adds it to the form as a button that you can click. When you click that button in the form, it actually executes that iLogic rule. And you can also add certain properties from the document, again, just by dragging and dropping. And then if you need to delete controls from your form, right-click and delete, like that. All right, so I want to add all of the parameters as controls to my form that the user is going to end up interacting with. And right now, this list of parameters that are being shown is showing all of my user parameters because there's a filter up here. You can set it to all, which will include the model parameters as well. Or there's renamed, which is any parameter that has been renamed. Or there's also key, which currently none of those are marked as key, so there's nothing shown there. So this is listing all of my user parameters, and some of these I do want to add to my form, and some of them I don't because they're being controlled by formulas, and I don't want the user to input over those formulas. But I can't tell which is which just by looking here. So one nice trick is to go into our parameters editor, and for the parameters that we want to add to our form, I'm going to mark them as key. So basically anything that the user is going to be inputting, I'm going to mark that as a key parameter. Skip any of the ones I don't want them modifying through the form. And then I'm going to go back to my form. And this filter is now set to key. It's showing just the ones that are marked key. So I can go ahead and drag the rest of these over and make myself a basic form here. All right. So I'm going to hit OK. It's going to save my changes to the form. And as you may have noticed, there's now a button listed under my Forms tab that when I click that button will activate the form, will launch the form. So here it is. And I can just change any of these values and the model will update accordingly. Now, one of the things you might immediately notice is this pattern type is a drop down between two different options here, but I can't see the full option because my form is too narrow. So it's a simple matter of just dragging your form and resizing it. And it should remember that size. So the next time I launch the form, it should be the width I last set it at. I have noticed sometimes where that isn't always robust, stable, if you will. Sometimes it'll forget and revert to what it was. And usually when that happens, what I'll do is instead I'll go in back and edit the form. And if you would adjust the width in the form editor, it seems to be a little more stable, a little more reliable. So keep that in mind if you see it reverting back to something you don't want. All right, so let's talk about some of the general properties of the form. To see those, you want to make sure you're selected on the top node here that represents the form itself. And then the properties listed down here are the settings for the form. And one of the things we'll want to do is the label, which is the name that shows up in the title bar here. I can adjust that by typing here, or I can also adjust it by typing here as well. That's the label. So I'm going to rename this to something a little more useful. And this also is what shows up in the name of the form. Once I hit OK and save this change, that's what shows up in this button as well. All right, so some of these other settings are you can control how the form is laid out. Text location for contents is going to be where the label is relative to the form field. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the settings for the individual controls. You've got font size and show item borders, and these are essentially defaults for the entire form. Most of the controls have their own versions of these settings, like text location and font for that individual control, but you can set the defaults for the entire form and in fact override. So if you've had any changes, if you change the font for this particular form and then go back, or this control, and go back to the main form settings and set the font here, it'll override any changes you've made to the individual controls. So if you're going to be setting any of these, you'll want to set them right up front before you make any individual overrides to the parameters so that those don't get lost. The visual style is just how the form looks. They have several predefined settings you can choose, and it's just how it looks. So you can kind of flip through there and see if there's ones that you like. I'm fine with the default, so I'll go with that. And this setting here, if you read, it's called modal. If this is false, then you can do other things in Inventor while the form is displayed. Well, it's currently set to false, so I'll show you exactly what that means. If I go in here and I launch my form, I can actually do other things in Inventor, go through my ribbon, select different commands, whatever, while the form is active. But if I set that modal setting to true, that I'm not able to do anything like that. So let me demonstrate that. I don't know if you can hear that little Windows beeping at me. It's essentially saying, nope, you can't do that. I can't, I can't zoom, I can't pan, anything. The focus is on this form and just this form. And I can't do anything except within the form until I'm done and I hit click. And you'll notice there, it did actually revert my setting. I think when you change that, I've noticed when you change that modal setting, it can kind of mess that up. Even though I adjusted it in the editor here. So this is usually something you'll set right at the beginning when you first create your form. If you need it, it defaults to false. If you need it to be true, you'd want to set it there. Some of the reasons you might want to set it to be true is if you have this form as part of an iLogic routine, you're running some iLogic code and you have a form display to prompt the user for input, then you basically want to lock it so that the user has to fill out that form and hit done or OK to continue with the routine without being able to go to other things that might disrupt what the routine is actually doing. So you want to control how the user is interacting with your form in that way, lock them out from doing anything else that might be disruptive. So, okay, the next thing I want to talk about is this predefined buttons right here. This is determining what buttons are being offered to the user down at the bottom. Right now it's set to done, but we also have OK, cancel, apply, OK, cancel, or just none with no buttons down there. And this is doing more than just setting which buttons are available. It's actually controlling the behavior of the form itself. And let me show you what I mean. So when it's set to done, as we saw, when I come into the form and make changes, as soon as I click out, I made a change to this parameter. As soon as I click out, that parameter is written to the model, and the model updates accordingly, and it updates immediately. Okay, and that's the behavior you get if you have it set to done or none. You'll get that immediate update behavior. But if you've got it set to either OK cancel or OK cancel apply, then it behaves differently in the sense that I can input the values, switch to a new parameter, and the model does not immediately update. It's waiting for me to click OK or apply in order to actually apply those changes. So, and in case you don't know, clicking OK will apply the changes and close out the dialog box. Clicking apply will apply the changes and keep the dialog box open. Okay, so different behavior in the form. And the reason you might want to choose between one or the other is if you've got some automation involved with your model that you want things to happen in a certain order, you can control how things are being triggered by choosing which type of buttons are available here. If you want your model to be able to immediately update, you need to make sure you've got either done or none. But if you want to control it so that the user can input various parameters without it triggering any automation from happening, then you'll for sure want to use OK, cancel, or apply. All right, last setting I want to talk about in the main form is this show on place component. Currently it's set to false. What this does is if this is set to true, then when I go and place this component into another assembly, it'll place the part, and then it'll launch the form from that part to allow me to configure the part that I've just placed. So let me demonstrate that. I'm going to go ahead and set this to true and save my model. Then I'm going to switch over to this assembly, and I'm going to hit place. There's my part there. And so far, this just looks like normal for placing a part. But as soon as I place it, because I've set that option to be true, it actually pulls up the form for that part, which allows me to configure it to whatever I want it to be. And then I can continue placing additional instances of that same part, and then close my form there. So that allows you to configure it on the fly. Now, keep in mind, we are actually configuring the original part itself. So if I switch back to this part, you'll see it's got the settings that I just set. If I want to use it more as a template where I can place a part, configure it, and then place another part and configure it differently from the first one, that instead what I will want to use is, go ahead and save that, this place iLogic component, which will work more like a template, where I choose the part that I want to place, hit open, and then when I place it, what it's actually going to do is generate a brand new component, a new part file, and then pull up the form, allow me to configure it to whatever I need. And then if I continue to place more, it'll place more of that particular, more instances of that same component. But then if I want to do it again, I just repeat the process, place iLogic component, and then it'll create a new part file, and different from these. Let me demonstrate that really quick. I'll just pull up this is my folder that I've got it saved in. There's the new instance of the part that it created there. There's the original, and then it just created a copy that is so it can be configured differently. So that's what that setting does. All right, let's talk about settings for the individual parameter controls. One of the things you'll want to do pretty soon is to set the label. Again, you can set the label here, or you can set it here. And that's actually what's going to be displayed to the user in the form. By default, it just comes in with whatever the parameter is named, but because of parameter naming rules, we can't have spaces, so they're not always the most readable things. And so it might make sense to go in and add spaces, or maybe format it a little bit differently, just to make it a little more readable for the user. Maybe take out some abbreviations if you want, or not. Like so. And this little control or setting right here called a tooltip. I'll show you how that works. Basically, whatever's typed in there as the tooltip, when the user goes and actually hovers their mouse over, which parameter did I put that on? Rounded corners. Hovers over that control, then a little tooltip's going to pop up with whatever you've got typed in there. So that can be useful if you need to explain exactly what a parameter means, what it's controlling, if that's not obvious from the name. Or I'm going to show you later that it's possible to enable or disable controls based on different criteria. And so it might be useful if you've got some parameters that might be disabled in some situations. It might be useful to have a tooltip that if they hover over it, it explains to them why that control is disabled, because that might not be immediately obvious to the user. They might wonder, hey, why is this grayed out? Why can't I change it? So the tooltip can be useful in that sense. All right, next thing I want to talk about is down here, this control type. So I'm going to go to my thickness parameter here and go down to the control type. Right now it's set to text box, which basically means just a box that you can type whatever you want in there. But there are other options. Right now for this, the other option is slider. So if I'm going to click that so you can see what that is, basically the user can just drag this slider to increase or decrease the value. And you can choose, now that I've set it to slider, this new property here for slider properties is available for setting the minimum value. So for my thickness, let's say I want the minimum value to be 1/4 inch, maximum to be 2 inches, and then the step size, how much it goes for each, how much it increases or decreases for each tick that you drag the slider. And there you go, that's how slider works. That's useful if you, again, need to specify a minimum or a maximum, or need to control the increment that they choose for that parameter. All right, on my whole quantity, I want to control this so that the user can only choose specific values. Namely, I just want them to be able to choose even quantities for the holes. Right now, it's set to a text box, and the only option I have is text box and slider, just like with the thickness. But since what I want is a drop-down, so in order to do that, I have to go back to my parameters editor and change the way that this parameter is defined. I want to right-click on my whole quantity and make multi-value. And then I'm just going to add into this the exact choices that I want to offer to the user. So just even numbers here. Then I click add. So from 4 to 24, these are the values that will be offered. And now this is a drop-down. The user can choose whatever option is available. Now I'm going to go back into my form, and I want my form to offer that same drop-down. But right now it's just the text box where they can type whatever they want. So I'm going to click on a whole quantity, and I want to set this to be not text box. But right now, because I've already placed that parameter into the form and then changed what type it was, for whatever reason, this doesn't automatically update to offer the new choices. So what I have to do is I actually have to remove this control and then add it back in. And then you'll see now I've actually got some different choices available for the control type. I've got combo box, which is going to be the drop down of different numbers. I can also do a list box, which is, it shows the entire list of available choices. And you just pick one, or I can do radio group. I'll show you more on those later. But for this one, I want to set that to combo box. Now, because I had to add it, maybe now it's not in the place that where I had it before is what I really want. So I need to drag that back up, and it's to move components around. It's just a simple matter of dragging and dropping. And you'll notice the little arrow off to the left there is changing, allows me to either drop it at a component, or maybe if I specifically need to go below it, you can control how that's working. So easy enough to move things around. We'll be doing that a lot as we go through this. All right, the next parameter I want to set is my pattern type. That's another, right now that's set to a combo box, and I have a choice between two different options. And instead I want to use, I could use a list box. Again, that just shows all the available options in a box, and you select whichever one you pick is the one it uses. Or I can use a radio group, which is very similar. It just has a little radio button to choose. And that's what I want to use for my pattern type. The rounded corners parameter is a true-false parameter, so it's got some different control types available. The default is true-false, which is basically just a drop-down. It's like a combo box, just a drop-down that offers the options of true or false. Or we can set it to be a checkbox. So when it's checked, then the value is true. When it's false, it's unchecked. And that's what I want for my rounded corners parameter there. One thing you might have noticed is some of these properties are displayed in bold text. And essentially what that means is if a property has been set to a setting that it's not default, then it's going to show in bold. So the default for this true-false control type is the true-false. When I set to that, it's not bold. That's the default value. If I change it to anything other than, basically if I'm overwriting the default, then it shows it as bold. Just as a quick notice to you, the user or the developer of the form, what's been overridden from the default values. Okay, let's get into the toolbox and talk about the different tools that are available here. This first one here is group. So I'm going to drag one of these over, just like with the controls. If you want to use an element of the toolbox, you just click and drag it over into your form builder here. And it drops this in here. And essentially what a group is kind of a collapsible, divided off section of your form. And to put specific parameters into a group, you just click and drag them to that group control, and then it places them underneath it. And you can see now the thickness parameter is part of that group. So let's say I wanted to set up two different, to visually distinguish between the parameters that are controlling the plate dimensions versus the whole pattern dimensions. So I can divide them off into different groups that way. And right now it's just displaying group 1, group 2. So I will want to change the label there and call them what it is. This is going to be my plate dimensions. This is my pattern dimensions. Okay. Now, I don't really, you see that these groups can actually be collapsible, which I don't really find to be all that helpful, because it can, as you can see, it kind of does weird things with the formatting of your controls. But I do find the groups useful as just a kind of a visual separation of the different elements of a form and to group them together. All right, the next option here is going to be a tab group. I'll add one of those, and that's going to add some tabs to your form. So typically you'll not just have one tab group, but you'll have 2 or 3 multiple tabs. So you can switch between which controls are displayed in the form. So I'm actually going to let's drag these to tabs instead of groups. You'll see the difference. So instead of doing groups to separate them, I'm going to use tabs to separate them. So now you can see, got them broken out like that. So this will be my plate dimensions, and this will be my pattern. I want to name those so the user can see what those are. Now I've got these empty groups here. I can just delete those. If you have any controls in a group or a tab when you delete it, it will also delete those controls. So keep that in mind. I think that might pop up a warning asking you if you want to do that. Okay. You can also, if you want things outside of a tab, you don't have to have everything in a tab. If I have something that I want to be outside, I can drag it and make sure the arrow goes to the arrow that looks like it's inserting above. That's what it's doing there. So now thickness is not on any of my tabs, so it's available regardless of which tab I have selected, or I could also drag them below. Let's put this back in there. It's in the wrong place. There we go. Now, you can also nest tabs, so you could have tabs within tabs. So I'm going to add another tab group to the pattern tab. So you can see now I've got tabs here. So I could put full diameter on one tab, full quantity on another. And just to demonstrate what you can do there. And if I need to drag these around, I want maybe to those tabs to be on top, then there we go. Now they're on top. Now, one of the things you'll notice here is that this control is acting a little funny in how it's spacing itself out, how it's sizing itself. And you'll see that a lot in these iLogic forms. iLogic forms are a really powerful tool to be able to quickly create a user interface form. And Autodesk has put a lot of effort into making this as user-friendly as possible to create these forms. If you've ever developed a form in like Visual Studio, you'll know there's quite a bit that goes into creating a form and controlling how it looks. And Autodesk has automated most of that for us and basically whittled it down to making it so easy for us that all we have to do is drag and drop things to add, and it takes care of all that stuff behind the scenes for us, which is fantastic. But it does end up with some things that are a little odd sometimes. And one of those things is usually the form itself and individual tabs will size themselves to the maximum of what is on the entire form. So this plate tab is completely filled out with my controls. But if I switch over to the pattern tab, then the controls that I have here wouldn't fill that entire space, but the tab is still as big as it was for tab 1. Hopefully that makes sense. And for whatever reason, this particular control, the radio type box, just resizes itself to fill whatever space is available. So it's just taking up that extra space to fill this tab. And so it looks a little weird. One thing you can do, there are some things you can do to manipulate and try to fix some of these weird little quirks of the form. And one thing I can do here is I can actually just take this empty space control and drag it to my pattern tab, and it'll drop it right below pattern type. And now it's basically, I've put an object called empty space there that's taking up that space, so this control doesn't have to try to fill everything in. And that helps, makes it look a lot better. Another thing I could do to help would be to set this pattern type text location, instead of being on the left, and set that to be on top. And I think that looks a little bit better. I want to do the same thing for this thickness control over here. Drag that back to the top there. Because here's the label, and there's a lot of empty white space around it before the actual control. So it just looks awkward. So for that one, I'm going to do the same thing, set the text location to be on top. So now the label is above the actual entry field of the control. So that looks a little bit better. You can also if you want, take some of these controls and you can do left, right, top, bottom. So if I did right, that's going to put the label on the right-hand side. That obviously looks a little weird there. Don't want to do that for this particular control. What I actually want to do with these controls is I want these to be plate length X on right here, and then plate length Z to be next to it. And the way you do that inside these forms, everything we drag in here is basically laid out top to bottom in the form. But if you need something to be side by side, then they've given us this control here called row. We'll just drag that over. I'll drag it onto my plate tab there. And then right now there's nothing there because I haven't put anything. All I have to do is I have to tell it which controls belong on that row. So I'm going to start with my plate length X, drag it down. And then, so there's plate length X. Right now it doesn't really look any different than it did before. We put it back in its spot that it was before because that's the only object on the row, which is essentially what we had to start with. But if I drag the other parameter onto that row control, then you'll see it stacks them side by side. So that's more what I want there. Another weird little quirk that you'll see is with the label spacing and how it controls horizontal spacing in the forms. And how it works is for a given section, whether it's a tab or a group or just not, just part of the form without a tab or group, whatever's in that section that has the longest label, that determines where the control fields actually, where the label field ends and the control field starts. So there's some extra space after these before the actual entry field starts because this rounded corners takes up that much space. So you can, if it looks awkward, you can control that by maybe adjusting what some of your labels are. Like if I needed to shorten that, I could maybe just change that. You'll see it adjust. Now this is the longest one. So they've all resized to go to this, to start here instead. Sometimes you don't have a choice, like rounded corners. I don't know, maybe rounds make sense, but that seems a little more ambiguous. Maybe I really do need this to be rounded corners. Then I don't have much of a choice. That's just how much space it's going to take up. I could set the controls again to be on the top. That actually doesn't look too bad. So maybe I'll do that for both of those. Yeah, that's not too bad. So these little tricks are, you'll just have to try things to see what works and what doesn't. This corner radius right here, I don't like that this control is going all the way across. It looks a little odd. So if I want to, what I can do is actually add another row, put the corner radius on the row, and then take an empty space and put it on that same row next to it. So it fills in an empty space here, and then my control width is only this, which looks a little better to me. You can adjust the actual size of an empty space. By default, if this is set to 0, then it's just kind of dynamic and fills what it needs to fill. But if you need to adjust it, then you can click on that. For example, like right here on this tab, I've added an empty space below pattern type, and I can basically control how much vertical space it's taking up by adjusting the height. So maybe I don't want it to take up as much space as it is now. So like it stretches this out a little bit more vertically. So I can increase or decrease it to adjust the other things that are around it. All right, the next tool I want to talk about is this label. And basically that's just, there we go, there it is. I wanted that to be above, there we go. That's basically just some text that you can have show up in your form. So, notes, all parameters are in inches, something like that. If you just need some notes and text to show up on your form, that's what the label does. You can automate the labels. I'll talk about that in a little bit when we get into controlling some of the behavior. But I did want to mention, be careful where you add your labels, because they kind of follow the same behavior that I was talking about here, where the widest label in that section is going to control where the controls actually start. And so if I actually drag this, because this node is out, not in the same section, it's not affecting these, but if I were to actually drag it into this tab, then you'll see now this is the widest label, so it pushes all of these over here, which is really awkward. So you do need to be careful about that. You can maybe break this up into two notes that are stacked on top of each other, like the text wraps. You can try that if you need to. In this case, I'm okay because I'm in a different section. Or one thing you can actually do, if I needed it to be here, what I can do is actually just add a group to this plate, and then add that note to its own group, and then it'll stop affecting the ones in this group. But I don't want this group to show up like that. So what I can do is select the group, go to its properties, and set show borders to be false. And then it looks just like the group is not there, but it is. So it's basically just a logical group that's helping me contain my different controls, but it doesn't show up visibly over here. So that would be an option there. Drag that back out, don't need that group. Okay, the other option down here, the other tool is the splitter, and honestly, I have never seen what this is useful for. It adds this, where did I drop that? Oh, it's in this tab. It adds that weird little thing there, but I don't know what it does. If I go to the actual form, I mean, it acts like you can click and drag it, but it doesn't really seem to do anything. So I'm not exactly sure what use that is. I've never found a use for that. So, you know, if some of you guys know, then cool. Please let me know. You can find a good use for that. All right, let's talk about controlling the behavior of the form a little more advanced. So you can control, I mentioned it earlier, that you can enable and disable parameters based on a parameter, essentially. And the way this works is for example, I want this rounded corners radius to not be available if this is unchecked. If there's no rounded corners, then I don't want the user to have to bother inputting a radius for the corner. So the way that works is I'm going to go to my corner radius parameter, and I want that to be disabled. So I'm going to go down to this enabling parameter name. And how that works is I can choose a true false parameter that if it's true, that parameter is enabled. If it's false, it's disabled. And so when I click this drop down, it shows me a list of all of the available true false type parameters that I have. Currently, I just have the one, which is the rounded corners, which is exactly what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And then I'm going to go out here and launch the form and show you how that works. Like right now it's checked. This is enabled. If I uncheck it, this is now disabled. So we can start to build in some smarts into our form for helping our users input what is important to input. Now, I also, let's say I want to get a little fancier and put some kind of logic to, a little bit more advanced logic to what's going on here. Let's say if my thickness is greater than 1 inch, then I don't want rounded corners to even be an option. So I want to basically disable this rounded corners control. Oh, that's corner radius. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so go down to enabling parameter name. And right now I don't have anything set up. So I need to go and create a true false parameter that I can use to control that. And usually for parameters that are specifically controlling my form behavior, I'll just preface those with UI, user interface, just to let me know that parameter specifically for form control. And I'm going to call this rounded corners option. Okay. I'm going to go back in here, go to my rounded corners parameter, set the enabling parameter name to UI rounded corners option. So now it's controlled based on that parameter, but I haven't set up the logic to control that when it's true or when it's false. So I will want to go into my iLogic rule. Actually, no, I want to start a new iLogic rule specifically for controlling the parameter. And so I'll usually call that form control. And this is just going to be a simple if statement. If thickness is greater than 1, then I want my new parameter UI rounded corners option to be false. Otherwise, I want it to be true. Okay, save and run that. Now, let's launch our form. And you can see if I am below 1 inch, it's fine. I have the option to add rounded corners. But if I go above 1 inch, now this option is disabled. So that's working the way I want. But I want the actual corner to not be an option, to not just be an option to select, but to actually not be chosen, selected. And I want this corner radius to go away. So I will want to add just an extra little bit of control here. Actually want to add that to my feature control. And that's going to be the same logic if thickness is greater than 1. Then I want to actually set the rounded corners option to be false. All right, now it should behave the way I want. So if it's above, it's disabled and turned off, unchecked, and that which disables this. But if it goes below, then the option is available. I actually don't want that to default turn on, so I would change this to just say not do anything. Basically let the user choose. So it turns it off if I go above, enables it but doesn't turn it on unless the user specifically turns it back on. Okay, so that's how you can control the enabled state of parameters, but you can also do it for entire groups or tabs. They also have an enabling parameter name, so you can disable all of the parameters at once in an entire group or tab based on a parameter. All right, let's talk about, and we are running short on time. Let's talk about, you can also do the same thing for text. They also have a parameter name, but in this case, it's not for enabling, it's for actually controlling what is displayed in the text. And in this case, so it's not going to be a true false parameter, you're actually going to choose a text type parameter. And I'm running a little short on time, so I don't have time to show you that. Basically what you do is come into your parameters editor, create a text parameter. So add text, and then whatever value is in that field, in that parameter, would be what would show up in here in the label itself. And then you could write some additional iLogic, whether it's in your form control or other iLogic rules to control what that text says in different situations. All right, I did want to talk about these tools here, picture and picture folder. So you can add a picture to your form. If I just click and drag it onto the form, adds a picture. Right now, there's no picture assigned to it, so it says no image data. But if I select that control, go to image, I can add an image. It adds it to my form. I could have that be on a specific tab if I wanted, or in a group, or just on the main form itself like this. And that can be useful for icons, for diagrams like this, schematics, pretty pictures, whatever you want it to be. And you can also control a picture. So if you need your picture to swap out, these also have a parameter that you can assign. The way this works is, in order to do that, you have to pick, again, a text type parameter. So you create a text type parameter, and the value of that text parameter is going to be the name of the picture you want it to display. So, but the way it works is you have to have this other control here called a picture folder. Because the way this works, I loaded an image from my hard drive, but now that it's loaded into my form, it's not actually referencing the actual PNG on my hard drive anymore. That PNG actually got loaded into the form in this document. And so I don't need to have that, you know, if that picture on my hard drive gets lost, the form will still be worked just fine because it's now a part of the data of the form. So a picture folder is basically a place where you can load multiple pictures into the form. And that works by just clicking here. Just like before, I can add this picture. And then for the other picture, I can add a different image. If I needed to add more, I could just grab this little picture icon here and drag it to the picture folder, and it adds another row. So if I needed more than two, I don't in this case, so I'm going to delete that. So I've just got these two that I can swap between. And then in my actual picture that represents what's displayed in the form, you'll see when I added the picture folder, it didn't actually, you can't see that in the form anywhere. It's just data in the background. But when I go to the actual picture that's in my form, if I set this enabling parameter name, it's a text parameter where I would put picture, its value could either be picture 2 or picture 3, and depending on which one it is, it's going to choose which of these is displayed. And you can change the name of that. If picture 2 and picture 3 is too vague, you could actually just, what I do is copy and paste the name of the file or the image itself and rename that so it's a little more descriptive of what it's switching between instead of just picture 2, picture 3. So let me demonstrate that real quick, just in case that's not clear. So I'm going to add my text parameter here. And it can be either that or the other one. Maybe I'll make that a multi-value. So we'll skip the logic step. There we go. Okay, now when I go back into my form, I need to set that picture to use that parameter. There we go. Now let me launch the form and show you how that works. So here's my picture. Oh, I don't have the actual form available. I didn't set up the logic, so let me just add that. Oh, this is set to key. There we go. Just add picture as a control. Now when I set this, swaps out the image. Okay. One other thing about the pictures, as you can see, this picture is maybe a little bit too big. My original form was only about this big, and adding the picture just made it gigantic. So there's a lot of wasted space and stretched out controls here. So instead of adding the form as an image to the control or to the form itself, what I could do is instead add a button that the user could click to launch the form or launch the image. And the way that works is I would actually create a new form that is just the image. So I drag a picture over, set my picture, and I can set this up to have a picture folder and be able to swap between the two just like I did in the other one. But essentially now I've got this other form that represents the picture, but I can't just add a form. Forms are not available as a type of control you can add, unfortunately. But what I can do is add rules. So what I will do is set up an iLogic rule that just launches that form. It's called form 2, so that's just the name of whatever it is. Okay, so when that rule runs, it just launches the form, right? Run rule launches the form. Now I'm going to go to my main form, and instead of having, pardon me, the picture take up all that space, I'm just going to add an iLogic rule, here's my rule, as a button to the form. And then when I click the button, then it launches that diagram. So you'd want to be a little more descriptive instead of just saying, rule 2, I would rename that to show diagram, right? So that's what the button's going to say, show diagram. There we go. Okay. That's the majority of what I wanted to cover. There is a little bit more about global forms. So these forms are actually stored in this document itself. If I opened another part file, it would not have this form. But if you need something like that, that's what global forms are for. And you see I've got this one set up to help me enter drawing properties. And so the idea would be is I'd have a drawing open. And if I go to my forms, click on drawing properties, if I enter stuff here, it's basically going to enter what I've got set up for my title block. And so I've got them laid out. The nice thing about the form, I can just access these through the iProperties, but the nice thing about the form is I can lay it out. It's pretty similar to how it's laid out in the actual title block. So visually, it's a little more accessible and easier to fill out. And I've got the separate section here for my sign-offs. Those are laid out in the same order. But the idea with the global form is that's available no matter what. I just started a brand new drawing, and the form's available for it no matter which document I have open. And those are set up by actually storing that form information on your local workspace in the design data folder. There's an iLogic subfolder and then a UI subfolder. And so there's my drawing form. That XML actually represents the information necessary to build that form. And then each of them come with this state file, which is how it remembers where on the screen the form is. And if it's been stretched or resized, it keeps track of that in that state XML file. And we're getting pretty close to running out of time. I do want to leave some time if we have some questions, Nigel.
Yeah, absolutely, Cameron. Let's take a look at a couple of these. So I think some of them, let's answer this question too. It's like, how do you share forms between you and like other people? I think that's one that's come up here a couple of times.
Well, if it's a global form, then you can share it by sharing this XML. And you'd also want to share that, which tells Inventor which forms to list in the global forms field. So if it's global, you can share it that way. If it's a local form, you really can't just copy and paste your local forms as, well, maybe you can. Look at that. There's a copy form option. That might actually work. If all else fails, you could just share the document and then, I'll check that out. That works. Now, none of these parameters are going to exist in this brand new file that I created, so you can see what happens there. Anything that doesn't exist that's part of the form, it just gets struck out and grayed out. But that is a way to share your forms.
Cool. Yeah. So pretty much you're just going to want to, like, say, for example, you're using it as a template. You just want to share that file around. You could share the XMLs around, put those in design data folders, and run through it that way. There's a lot of questions that are specific to people's code. If you have any specific questions on like something you're doing that's going wrong, send that question to lifeline@kativ.com. It's a little hard to, I guess, diagnose people's actual code issues while we're on a webinar here. So it might require us taking a look. And we can look at a couple things, but we really can't, what's the word here? We can't, I guess, fix your code if it's broken with regular support. But we've done it for people before as like extra projects and stuff. So just FYI on that one. Let's see here. Generally, a lot of the questions are specific to a couple of things that people are doing themselves. So it looks like we should be okay. Just a real quick question for everyone who's listening right now. Was this something you guys enjoyed? Is this something you guys want to see again? Yes, no, maybe. Yes, but not with Cameron. I'm just kidding.
Oh, man. Harsh.
Absolutely. And then for just one other thing too is like for like wrapping text on forms, Cameron, is there any strategy for that if the text is like super long for some reason?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of options available to do that sort of thing. It comes down to just like what kind of trickery you can get away with by manipulating empty spaces, or like I said, if I wanted to wrap this, I could just put another note underneath it and then, have the first note be half the text and the other note be the other half.
Right, but nothing that just like restricts the size of the line and then immediately hits a return. It'll just keep going on forever. So yeah, just make.
I don't know. We can try adjusting this and see if there's something that it does there, but I've never seen that.
Yeah, I think it might have been Eric who was like looking at this. I know someone here was looking at something similar and they couldn't get it to work. So.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be having an effect. I mean, the width of it is actually 21, and if I put like 10 in there. It doesn't seem to be changing
Mm-hmm.
that at all. So
cool. All right. That's it for questions that I have time for today. But if anyone else has anything to ask us about, feel free to send it to like questions@kativ.com or lifeline@kativ.com. We can go ahead and address those there. That last one from Tom there. There will be a couple of us there probably. I don't know who exactly on the team is going to be at AU. There will be Kativ people there. I don't know who yet. If you want to see myself or Cameron there, send us an email and then I can forward it to management and try to get us to go. But yeah, so with that, again, thanks everybody for being a part of AVA today. Thanks again, Cameron, for sticking with us. And thanks for everyone for, staying a little bit longer than the hour allotted time. Definitely appreciate it. I'm glad that everyone got the information that they wanted or needed to be able to, be more productive in the software that they use for work every day. So thanks again, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. Later, Cameron.
all right, bye. Thanks.